Arturo Desimone is a columnist for Counterpunch magazine and Subdivision magazine. He is an activist and a major figure on the left, as far as I'm concerned. You're coming back again to the Subdivision Media Podcast. Welcome back, Arturo.
Thank you very much for your very kind words.
So you recently wrote, back on May 9th, not that long ago, a piece for Counterpunch entitled "The Last Regime Change and the Left's Lateness in Opposing Biden's Wars." And I wanted to discuss that with you. One of the questions that you try to answer in your piece is just what is Biden's position? What is his policy objectives regarding Gaza and Israel? And I think that, would it be fair to say that the one of the primary myths that you're trying to overturn is the myth of Israel dictating to the United States what its policies are going to be, what the U.S. policies are going to be?
Partly. Well, I want to take away the mystery around that. There's an illusion that there is great novelty in what Biden is doing. And that's a very dangerous illusion, I think, because it allows everyone in the conversation or in the culture war to also make up an excuse to contradict themselves. If we pretend that Biden, with his new foreign policy, that apparently new foreign policy direction on Gaza, is contradicting himself, then we allow everyone to make excuses for their own self-contradiction, including, for example, the Republicans who 10 minutes ago were, the heterodox Republicans, because the mainstream Republicans supported the Ukraine war and the crackdowns on anti-Ukrainian speech. But heterodox Republicans 10 minutes ago were complaining about censorship against anti-war voices. When it came to the Ukraine war, they were complaining against the crackdown on their civil liberties by this technocratic administration. They were objecting to the billions of dollars going to Ukraine. Now, these heterodox Republicans, the people who write for Compact magazine, they're not all Republicans, of course, like I am not, and Ashley is not, but they, now they support billions of dollars sent towards Israel. Now they are in favor of a crackdown on pro-Palestinian or pro-Gaza or pro-human rights anti-war voices suddenly, and they see no contradiction there. And also, progressives seem very unself-critical. And so this whole, I think it's a good thing. I celebrate that there's opposition to this war, but it seems to have come, as they say, ex nihilo, out of nowhere. And so there's this illusion that's, I think, dangerous, which is the illusion that Biden has somehow contradicted what he was doing in the previous 3 years. He's definitely contradicted the Obama administration to some extent, because he, just took over Trump foreign policy to the hilt, to the letter, but he hasn't contradicted the past 3.5 years of his administration's very bellicose foreign policy. So I see a danger for that, not just a danger that anti-Semites will take advantage of the impression that Biden's weakness is because he's beholden to Israel, but also there's another danger on top of that of self-deception for the left and also for the heterodox right, also the anti-war right.
And for the heterodox left as well.
Yes, right? Yes. I guess that's us.
That's us. Yeah, we have to be careful as well. I wanted to get to your suggestions and theories about Biden and his aims in Gaza, and because I think, from my perspective, the way you explain that is really the most interesting, and really is the heart of your piece. But in order to get there, I'm going to do something heterodox, which I've been doing quite a lot lately on Twitter, which is I'm going to mention what the pro-Zionists and the American pro-Zionists, the tablet, seem to think, which is they view the protest movement not as inorganic, but as shaped by a faction of the Democratic Party, primarily the Obama faction of the Democratic Party, as opposed not to Trump, but to the Clinton faction of the Democratic Party, which Biden might be more aligned with. And I guess what this means is that the Obama administration has been perceived ever since the deal with Iran that as being involved in a pivot away from supporting the Zionist entity and towards trying to set up a kind of balance of forces in the Middle East between the Arab nations and Israel, and forcing normalization not only on the Arab states but on Israel as well. What do you make of that kind of understanding of the protest movement as being, given that it was funded by the Tides Foundation and that the organizations that called for the protests, especially on campuses, were tied to the Democratic Party?
Well, I think it's a bit of an esoteric analysis coming from tablets. First of all, Biden and Blinken very inexplicably, only because no one asked them for an explanation, nobody confronted them, but they very inexplicably trashed and vandalized the Iran nuclear deal, which was one of the major diplomatic achievements and one of the few diplomatic achievements that coincided with the Obama administration. I think Norman Finkelstein insisted in a letter he responded of mine that Obama was not an important actor in the Iran nuclear deal. He just presided over it, or he tolerated it. However, if there were any such dovish aspects to Obama's overall hawkish foreign policy, Biden has very aggressively gone against these. Biden has embraced the Trump maximum pressure policy on Iran, the Trump maximum pressure policy on Cuba, which is the only, that was also Biden's hash brain. I don't know the expression in English. I forget the expression in English, but that was his harebrained approach to a strategy to try to win back the Latino votes that Trump had mysteriously won by satisfying, reactionary Cuban and Venezuelan diasporas in the United States by getting very aggressive on Cuba and having a Trump posture on Cuba, having a Trump posture, less of a Trump posture on Venezuela. And also Biden, he was very docile about Trump's decision, which was unprecedented, in having moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. That was not a Clinton position at all. That was a Trump position, and Biden inherited that Trump foreign policy aspect. So I think that Trump maybe showed the establishment, because Trump was an outsider in a sense. He was an amateur. I mean, he was always, in the social circles of these politicians, but he was just a kind of party animal or a personality in their social lives. He was never a politician. So because he was an outsider, an autodidact, he impressed the establishment by showing them that they could take risks that they previously had not imagined were possible. So he taught them maybe a lesson in being bold and in risking all kinds of explosive situations, and the world still exists after he took those risks, like moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. I think he, gave a nuclear reactor to Saudi Arabia. I think Noam Chomsky pointed that out. I don't believe that the thesis that this is a pro-Obama rebellion holds water. Obama also, even though he has been now critical of the occupation, and he certainly was a bit more contained than Biden, or a bit more interested in preserving America's image in the world. I think the whole purpose of Obama was to try to undo the damage that George W. Bush had done in terms of the perception of the United States in the way it alienated the rest of the world. It's clear that Obama, he tried to refer to the illegal settlements as unhelpful, right? Which is kind of like the epitome of, politically correct or woke language, to say that's unhelpful when you're talking about, a violation of international law. So I think that tablets can be original in a way that is perhaps we could welcome. Like I know Jacob Siegel, he is, I think, genuinely right-wing, pro-Israel nationalist. So he thinks that Israel should not receive funding from the United States so that it can operate independently and, do the aggressive actions it wants to do. And I think that I think most of the region, even though it's a very hawkish position, I think most of the region would welcome it. And I think it would be for the better if Israel would fight its own wars and pay the price of its own wars, because the price of, going to war is to cause one's own citizenry great discomfort. And so I think part of what keeps the Israel-Palestine conflict or circus, or whatever you want to call it, going for so many decades is that Israelis can inhabit an illusion that much of the Western world inhabits, the illusion of living in a very safe, normal suburbia, a placid kind of suburbia, next to this immense ghetto in Gaza, and every so often waging wars the way Netanyahu previously waged them, which was, in the slang of the Israeli army, mowing the lawn, and which began to resemble an act of civil engineering. So I think what the October 7th attacks, which were horrible and which also violated the rules of war, but what they did was what an acquaintance of mine, Aboud Hamayel, in the West Bank, he says that the achievement of these attacks was to undo the Israelis' illusion that they could take the battle out of war and wage war as if it were civil engineering, as if it, with Iron Dome, with drone technology. And that's not a specifically Israeli idea. That's just a Western part of the Western way of life today. We have drone pilots sitting in Nebraska attacking parts of Yemen and Sudan, for example. That's the way of life of many French people who have no idea what their country is doing in Mali because they don't see any of it. Only these power relations are much more blatant in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflicts, and therefore they catch the world's attention much more rapidly, which is not to trivialize what's going on there right now, which is absolutely, totally terrible and sinister.
Well, I just want to point out that the tablet position was that not that Biden was a continuation of Obama, but that the Obama faction within the Democratic Party was putting pressure on Biden through calling these protests, that this was a pressure tactic within the Democratic Party. And I'm not sure to the degree to which that's true, but it does definitely seem to me that it is an intra-party protest movement, that it is that everyone involved in the protest movement conceives of its mission is to put pressure on the Democratic Party and on the Biden administration, that there really isn't an alternative politics.
Yes, but how much of that is accidental and how much of that is by design? So Tablet seems to be arguing that there's a conspiracy here, this is by design. I would just say it's accidental because the Republicans are more often they're pervaded by evangelical propaganda. Republicans are hostile to the Palestinian issue because woke millennials tend to have gravitated towards the Palestinian issue. So it's, there's not a lot of thought there in how these things became partisan issues. For example, Ukraine was once a Republican cause. It was Dick Cheney who said, "Fuck you, you hate freedom," to a room full of politicians, advisors who said to him that Ukraine should not be in NATO. Many prominent right-wing Ukrainians who are veteran members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the fascist anti-Semitic organization in North America, many of them are figures of the Republican Party. So how did this become a Democrat issue? How did criticizing Ukraine become a Republican or a heterodox Republican cause for anti-war Republicans? I think that it's more, unfortunately, there's not a lot of thought going into this. And similarly, Republicans, very few of them have Candace Owens' position simply because so many young people who are progressives, who don't go to church, who are secular. I mean, the Democratic Party, seen from afar, it seems like the Democratic Party is just the secular church of the secular part of the American middle class. The people who don't go to church consciously, they listen to Stephen Colbert, and so. But I or somebody acts like he's some preacher. Not that he's particularly pro-Palestinian. He's certainly a groupie for Obama, but I just don't believe that this is a top-down process. I think, to the contrary, that Obama does not want Biden's electoral chances to fuck up over this. I think that there are people who have a clear moral sense. Also, major cities are where young people are more likely to go to school with Arabs and Muslims, who are much larger minorities in the major cities, and the major cities tend to gravitate towards the Democratic Party and away from the Republicans. So I just think that it might be true that it's intra-party, but that's partly accidental or partly due to the fallacies, the incapacity of people in the U.S. to think beyond begging the U.S. to do something from below, and begging for top-down action. And indeed, there's a lack of other kinds of action other than this begging Blinken, who is clearly an idiot and a mouthpiece of a very senile president. But I don't believe that this is a conspiracy of the Democratic Party or of the Tides Foundation. Surely they do. But if they play a role, it has by now gotten out of hand. It has gone much further than they had intended, I would say.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but it wouldn't, a couple of points. It wouldn't be a conspiracy because it's not unlawful and it's not secret. The Tides Foundation support for the organizations that called for these protests on college campuses is a matter of public record. It's not a conspiracy. And the calls from these organizations were made in public as well.
Sure, I'm just saying that they're not.
And you can read about the split within the Democratic Party in the New York Times. It's a matter of actually just putting the pieces together more than it is a matter of uncovering a conspiracy. That'd be.
I'm not denying that they called for it initially, but I'm just saying that it's very likely that when they called for it, they thought, well, this will be like Black Lives Matter all over again. This will be innocuous. It won't go so far as it did. That's what I'm saying.
Well, Black Lives Matter went further than the protest movement has so far. Every
So,
major city in America, was on fire around the Black Lives Matter protests, and
yeah.
even then, this is more a conspiracy theory type thinking. Although again, it's a matter of public record now, but it was meant to be secret. The Democratic Party considered the Black Lives Matter protests after the worst unrest as assets for the Democratic Party during the 2020 campaign, as something that could be implemented as a pressure tactic if Trump refused to leave office after a close election. So I just think we should all be aware of how completely captured the left is and our protest movements are in this moment. That's all I would
Sure.
understand.
So, well, I would just respond, or as they say now, push back. That it's this funny word. That if that's happening, it's just both ways. There's an organic sense of it, of young people with a clear moral sense, who have gone to school with Muslims, who have followed this, who have a different upbringing. And there's also, of course, there's a very concerned element in the Democratic Party, particularly people who work in the State Department, who realize that Biden, has incredible power by virtue of executive power, and he's senile, and they're desperate because it's just very, very hard to force someone of executive power to do something that he clearly does not want to do, but they're aware that the consequences of this, electorally as well as for America's image in the world, will be absolutely terrible.
Yeah. All I would say to that is that I don't disagree with you at all that the kids, the students, are motivated by their true moral concerns, and that they, just in the way that you spoke of, but when that is the full extent of your political consciousness or your understanding, you aren't you're basically not, to put it in Hegel's terms, you're for another and not for yourself. You're ripe for manipulation. The terms of your protests are being determined elsewhere. There's organic dissent. There's a desire to change society, but then there's no ability to think through the problem so that you can come up with your own proposals and aims rather than the aims of the established order in one form or another.
Sure. I mean, they treat Israel Palestine as if it's in isolation with the rest of US foreign policy, and in isolation with the rest of the Middle East, and unrelated to global industries, particularly the arms industry, among others. The grip that defense contractors have on Biden has been very blatant and obscene from his very first weeks in office. One of the first actions that Biden did was to bypass Congress and to slam some rockets into the city of Erbil, a Kurdish city, because a U.S. defense contractor was killed by an attack by an Islamist. So immediately Biden bypassed Congress to do a mafioso type of revenge assault, bypassing Congress, and there was not a word of protest. Also, he shut down, this was also a preface, like way before the West canceled Russia Today and put Ashley Frawley out of a job since she was a columnist, I think. They shut down Press TV, which, I mean, Press TV is not an impressive source of information. It's an Iranian media, Iranian state propaganda channel. However, it's the state media of a country, and they just removed it on the internet as if to say, we, with the Pentagon, invented the internet, so it belongs to us anyway. So we're just going to, blot you out of the internet. It belongs to us. And that was just an omen, a foreshadowing of the war on the free internet that was brewing. And only now do people protest these algorithms that censor Palestinians. But where were they when it came to the past 3.5 years of an attack on the free internet, which was always about, controlling how people talk about U.S. foreign policy and about establishment figures, establishment values. So,
right, I totally agree. The question, I guess, that I really think that your essay helps us to answer is just what is the actual policy of the Biden administration and of the United States. And one of the ways in which you get at that question is by, first of all, pushing aside and discrediting the idea that the United States is simply acting at the behest of the Israeli lobby or of Israel by extension. I would say, just as an aside, the idea that the U.S. policy is dictated by defense contractors and the defense industry is probably no more accurate than the idea that it's dictated by the Israeli state, but rather that, yeah. But nonetheless, why would you put aside the idea that Israel is calling the shots here and is controlling Blinken and Biden?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Israeli desires from the Israeli leadership are clearly very influential and certainly carry a lot more weight than Palestinian desires. However, there are a number of factors. First of all, the Biden administration and its predecessors have been obsessed with regime change and have not, unlike what they were able to do in the Obama era, where they were able to carry out regime change disastrously, but they were able to do it. In the past 3.5 years, they have not managed to do a single one. It started with the terrible humiliation in Afghanistan with the Taliban. And I really doubt Biden, given who he is, given his education, given his view on the world, and given his very abject, racism towards basically everyone who doesn't have the surname Biden. I mean, I remember he was talking to some black journalist on CNN saying, "What are you, a junkie?" And no one noticed that. It was 2020 or so. I really doubt Biden's capacity to tell important differences between the Taliban and Hamas, or between the culture of the Afghan landlocked, very primal Afghan culture and the culture of Palestinians. He doesn't see the difference, and he's equating these two. I think that, so there was the failure in Afghanistan, there was the failure in Syria, there was a capitulation to Maduro. He definitely wanted regime change in Venezuela and ended up indulging Maduro. He definitely wanted regime change in Cuba because he maintained all of Trump's policies, which are devastating Cuba. The left has not said anything about Cuba for 4 years. He definitely wanted regime change in Iran. And now they get it by accident with the helicopter crash, which not even the Iranians are blaming this time around on an Israeli conspiracy. So he was not. This administration has been obsessed with regime change and has never been able to get it. And so Hamas was subject to a financial embargo the moment it won elections almost 2 decades ago. So they treated Hamas from the beginning like a regime that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Islamist parties these days, in this day and age, and I was there in Tunisia when an Islamist Muslim Brotherhood party, Ennahda, won the election. And I know I understand the psychological change. Islamists these days, they want to be tidy. They want to be seen as Christian Democrat parties. when Ennahda, an Islamist Muslim Brotherhood party, meaning they're directly in the same coalition as Hamas, when they lost the elections against Tunisian secular neoliberal party, they did not try to stay in office. They stepped down. And these are people who have very radical ideas. These are people who love Hamas, but they stepped down because they lost an election. So I think the same would have happened to Hamas. They would have accepted some kind of electoral defeat, but they weren't able to do the self-rehabilitation that Islamists around the world, including Erdogan, are seeking to do. That's why Erdogan is so happy to go to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, because he can pretend that he has an aura of legitimacy, whereas his people want him directly to do something more risky and to attack Israel, which is a much more frightening prospect, right? So he's happy to go to the International Court of Justice in The Hague to sign a letter that he supports this case, Erdogan, because he wants to rehabilitate as an Islamist as part of this legitimate world order, this rules-based order. But of course, the West doesn't care about whether or not he supports that case. They see him as a very useful thug and nothing more. And as inferior to them, of course. And so Saudi Arabia also wants to play the game of legitimacy. So Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been very vocal and critical of Israel at Davos, but also because they like the context. They like to be at Davos. And I think there's a prominent idea in the Arab world that Israel alone enjoys access to Washington in the Middle East, that the only way to gain access to Washington is via Israel. And I think that Arab world regimes, they like their population to have that idea that it's the Israeli who pulls the strings and who gets the attention from Washington, because that lets them off the hook. Then Arab regimes know that their populations are very sympathetic towards the Palestinians, but they don't want to feel pressured to act and to do, for example, what they did during the Yom Kippur War, which was to boycott all oil and petrol, all fuel to the West until the West would stop supporting this war in Palestine, and they got their wishes, they got their desires met. But that was a very different Arab world. That was an Arab world of an era of ideologies, of pan-Arabism. The USSR existed. My mother was in Israel in a kibbutz during the Yom Kippur War. She told me she had to go hide in a bunker. Maybe she'll have a mild heart attack if she hears me on this show. But back to the point of the Biden foreign policy, they fetishize regime change. They see Hamas as yet another dictatorship. And since they failed with Afghanistan, then they got very, very ambitious, because the Taliban in Afghanistan reminded the Biden administration of something that the left has totally forgotten about and totally abandoned. They were reminded of the power and the prowess of guerrilla warfare. Because here the Taliban, a guerrilla insurgent army with inferior weaponry, but who know the geography, were able to defeat colossal opponents. They defeated NATO. They sent many NATO soldiers back as amputees. So there, the Biden administration was reminded of the power of insurgent guerrilla warfare. And sadly, in a way, this defeat confirmed, Guevara's and the Guevaraist theories from the 1960s and 50s about the power of guerrilla warfare, in which a relatively small group of young, committed people who know the terrain, who know the geography, who might have inferior weaponry, but they have the people on their side. They do these these concerted strategic attacks. They can defeat a much more powerful enemy. And the aim of that theory of warfare was, as Guevara said, for there to be not one, not two, but many, many Vietnams. He looked very carefully at the Vietnam War, And of course, Afghanistan was said to be the Vietnam of the Soviet Union, right? That's what created a bleeding wound in the Soviet Union, and it couldn't stop bleeding after that, and it collapsed, right? So the defeat of the West in Afghanistan reminded the West of how Russia was defeated in Afghanistan, and reminded the West of the power of guerrilla warfare, which they sought to emulate in Ukraine. And the very beginning of that war, the Ukrainians greatly surprised the Russians with guerrilla warfare, and the west of Ukraine is ideal for guerrilla warfare, which is not ideologically of the left or right. I mean, like the Cubans hated Islamism. The only figure on the Western left who ever denounced Ahmadinejad for denying the Holocaust was Fidel Castro, I think. He was, not even Noam Chomsky denounced Ahmadinejad on the left for the denial of the Holocaust, but Fidel Castro did, even though he had material relationships with Iran. So guerrilla warfare is a tactic independent of ideology, and so we should never idealize or lionize a jihadist group because it uses this tactic, or a Stalinist group like the Shining Path in Peru, or FARC, because it uses this tactic. But it's a very effective tactic that was very much at the order of the day in the Cold War, when we spoke of freedom fighters rather than terrorists. And so when Biden was reminded, not Biden, but when the people in the Western foreign policy establishment around Biden were reminded of the power of guerrilla warfare, they tried this in Ukraine, and at first it succeeded. Then the Ukrainian war efforts became increasingly exhausted, demoralized, and colonized by the West, and it began to look more like trying to fight a conventional war rather than a guerrilla war with Russia. And it began to fail. So, nonetheless, I'm sorry to talk so long about this, but
no, it's okay. This is good.
Yeah. Nevertheless, when Biden realized, or when the Biden administration saw that the Ukraine war, which was an attempt to do regime change against Russia, and remember, they even failed to do regime change in Ukraine, because Zelensky was not Biden's man in Ukraine. Biden tried to run Ukraine like some neo-colonial fiefdom of him and of his acolytes, but Zelensky, when he was popularly elected, was not the preferred candidate of the Democrats, and Zelensky defeated Petro Poroshenko, who was the result of the coup, of the regime change of the Obama era, right? So the 2022 war had behind it the administration's hope of something quite colossal, which was, two things. One, to forget the demoralizing images from Afghanistan, to turn Zelensky into kind of hero, a kind of Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan, the Israeli general, back when Israel had a much more positive image in the West, and a much more positive image among Jews in the West also. Two, the purpose of the Ukraine war was quite megalomaniacal, to do regime change in Russia, right? And that failed. And other regime change attempts failed. So in the end, they are desperate, and the end of his presidential term is coming. The people who he responds to want to see a regime change, and so they're trying desperately to push through one regime change, again, as they did in Ukraine, outsourced to proxies, in this case the Israelis, and they cannot topple the Hamas regime. They sanction the Hamas, they demolish the cities, and they can't get rid of them. And so it's another failure of their regime change foreign policy.
Well, we'll see if Hamas is pushed aside or not. I do think that this is the main question that is that for people on the left to consider right now, to the degree to which the call should be for negotiations with Hamas and the acceptance of a PFLP Hamas coalition government in Gaza as some sort of negotiated two-state solution even might be brought to the table. That I do think that is the kind of far-reaching, sensible politics rather than,
I would
you know,
support
from the
that.
river to the sea. Yeah, you would.
Yeah, I would support that, but I don't know who else. The left is very divided and is calling for an overnight secular single state, and when it's and then it's clear that the West wants to see the uprooting of Hamas, permanent eradication of Hamas, and it's clear that Israel wants an international coalition to run the Gaza Strip. I believe that Hamas regards itself chiefly as a fighting force, and if they're able to achieve their objective, they won't. It won't be all that vital to them whether they also are able to administer uh, uh, these ruins. I think that if Saudi Arabia pays for the reconstruction of Gaza, that will be the end of Hamas by itself, because Hamas has a much closer relationship with Qatar, whereas the PLO has, or what's the PA has a much closer relationship with Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia and Qatar have a kind of very mild Cold War going on for a long time, and so I don't know. I hope that some, attempt to. I hope that the occupation, of course, can end. But that aside, I'm not sure who is supporting this the kind of model of government that you suggested.
Right. Well, I'm thinking it might be a faction within the Democratic Party. I don't actually have any evidence of that, but let's here. I'll speculate for a moment. And then you tell me why this is wrong, because I think it probably is wrong. But all right. So the Israelis push the population south. They've gotten almost everyone into Rafah. They are trying to root out Hamas. The goal is not to kill every Palestinian or even to ethnically cleanse Gaza, all right, but rather to avoid Israeli casualties as much as possible and mow the lawn deeply, to get rid of all the Hamas soldiers and to destroy them, to destroy Hamas. And they're willing to kill as many Palestinian civilians as necessary to do that. And so they've got them in Rafah. And at that moment, the United States, through the CIA, negotiations with Qatar and Egypt and Hamas to come up with a ceasefire agreement in exchange for Palestinians, shifting the aims of the conflict from destroying Hamas to retrieving the hostages or the bodies of the hostages and trying to put an end to the conflict at that moment.
I don't believe that Netanyahu wants to. I mean, the Israeli population wants the hostages back, and
Right.
the Israeli population clearly wants revenge, and they feel they have not gotten this revenge. First of all, because they are experiencing economic hardships because of this war, which is unusual. I mean, Israel usually is able to run a cost-free occupation and to continue this lifestyle of suburbia while being at war. This is the first time when the suburban illusion is disrupted. So Israelis do want war. They do want the hostages back. I cannot psychoanalyze Netanyahu. My guess is he's a sociopath, but that's my guess about Biden as well. However, I do find that it's more credible to think that Netanyahu, he's sensing that he's in checkmate now with the ICC and the ICJ. He's trying to stay afloat by any means possible, as long as possible. But I think that it has dawned on him that this is the end of his career. Benny Gantz definitely has, though he doesn't care for Arabs, he definitely has genuine objectives and genuine feelings about hostages. However, Netanyahu's coalition partners and Netanyahu has filled the shoes of Ariel Sharon and the settler movement. And for the settler movement, the great injustice was not this October 7th. For the settler movement, the great injustice was that their illegal settlement was evacuated from Gush Katif in, I believe, 2005 from Gaza, and they have wanted to go back to Gaza and and to hit back with many more settlements. That's also why the Netanyahu, the settler movement, said that there were terrorists in the UNRWA and the UN Refugee Relief and Work Agency, so that Blinken and Biden would cancel funding for the UNRWA, because UNRWA is not just the chief employer in Gaza, but UNRWA to them also embodies this idea of right of return, that refugees might crawl back into Gaza. So they want to finish with they want to be rid of the Palestinian issue. They really do want that, but I don't believe they'll achieve it.
No, but okay, but the question I was raising, the question I was raising was not about Netanyahu's aims, although I don't think to say that Netanyahu wanted to destroy Hamas is in contradiction to everything else that you just added to what Netanyahu wanted, right? No, the question was, what did the United States want a few weeks ago when they were trying to negotiate a ceasefire right before the invasion of Rafah, which would have been, if you put the humanitarian question to the side, if there was going to be a chance to actually defeat Hamas, it would have been in Rafah, and it will be in Rafah. So the United States was attempting to stop the Israeli forces from going into Rafah and negotiate a ceasefire at that moment. Shortly after that,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure Hamas is any. We don't know where the central command or where the major organisms of Hamas are. The Israelis cannot find them, and the Mossad and the CIA cannot find them, and so I don't think we can. Just
William Burns, though, was able to find Hamas to negotiate with them and get them to sign a ceasefire a few weeks ago. Yeah, and so whether they really represent the will of the Palestinians aside,
no,
they right. But William Burns wrote up a ceasefire agreement a few weeks ago, and Hamas was willing to sign it. The Israelis turned it down. So that's the CIA and the U.S. trying to impose a ceasefire at that moment, and against the will of the Israelis. After that, the United States, Blinken, who's thought to be weak and just sort of a puppet of Netanyahu by people on the left here, warned Israel that if it didn't do more to provide humanitarian aid and limit casualties to civilians, it would become the equivalent of Hamas. The paranoids at Tablet think that maybe Biden and Blinken gave Khan in the ICC the green light to seek the arrest of Netanyahu. I don't believe there's no evidence for that. But
Israel actually had lobbied very hard for Khan to have that position as head of the ICC. He was the preferred candidate of the Israelis. So I find that Tablets is speculating very wildly, because it's just very clear
that would seem to support the idea that Khan wouldn't act this way without some reassurance from the United States. I would think the fact that Khan was the preferred judge there at the ICC for both the United States and Israel. But I don't think that's necessarily true. The point I'm getting at, though, is just
I think he's in checkmate, and he's a Muslim, and so everybody he knows is putting him every personal relationship he has is putting him under pressure to do something, and he put himself in checkmate when he tried to, for the first time, I mean, the ICC was never liked by the United States, but he tried to curry the favor of the United States with the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, which I think was a hysterical attempt to impress the United States and to show his alignment to Atlanticism. And it was not even that respected by the United States. It did not win the ICC any real recognition or respect from the United States when he issued the arrest warrant prematurely for Putin. I'm not saying that there should not be at some point an arrest warrant for Russian war criminals. There should be, but it was premature. It sabotaged negotiation processes, because how can you negotiate with Putin if he cannot travel to meet you? So I think that when he made this very sentimental gesture, that set a precedent. And Muslims have been decrying the double standards where Russian war crimes matter and other war crimes don't for a long time. I mean, I am not, one of the leftists who sentimentalize Islam and Muslims, but Khan clearly is a Muslim, and so he's under pressure from everyone in his personal surroundings to do something to not, show that he's a complete failure and to not be completely ostracized from then on by his own community. So I think that and it took a very long time also. I think the real failure of the left is in having, bought into the illusion for a long time that the establishment does want a two-state solution.
Well, hold on. Because I just want to get to the end of this idea about Rafa and
Yes.
Blinken and William Burns, and so the question was
on the border.
And who wants a negotiated resolution with Hamas at the table? And my suggestion would be that, given the Blinken's warning to Israel and the willingness to constrain Israel at the moment where the Israelis believe they could possibly truly destroy Hamas in Rafah, that would have been a possible outcome if the ceasefire agreement had been taken up by the Israelis at that moment. Would have been the continued existence of Hamas and the necessity of negotiating for some sort of coalitional government in Gaza for some sort of coexistence.
Well, I think that if first of all they'd want a transitional regime, definitely without Hamas. I don't believe the West likes the idea of elections in the Gaza Strip. However, if Hamas would be, if any mix of officials from the PA and Hamas would be allowed to participate in a new government, there would have to be elections. I don't believe they would win the elections, but I don't know. I'm not an insider in Palestinian politics. However, I think that part of the deal would probably be, if there was a deal, Hamas would be asked to, as part of a concession of a Palestinian state, to withdraw itself from electoral party politics, and Mahmoud Abbas would be asked to resign as well, which would be, I think, a positive development. And I think Hamas would also accept to cease its electoral life in exchange for some kind of victory, any kind of victory for the Palestinians, to avoid infamy. I think they would accept it because, there's not that much left. And so, but that's speculation. But
so that would have been the regime change that Biden wanted then.
No, the regime change that Biden wants is a defeat of Hamas, a military eradication and uprooting of Hamas. But I think he cannot achieve that. I think that getting rid of Hamas is only possible through a peaceful negotiation process in which either A, Hamas agrees to disband as an electoral machine and to continue its life elsewhere in some other form of Muslim Brotherhood's association, or B, that the Saudis, of course, they want to pay, if they want to pay the price, the enormous price of rebuilding the Gaza Strip, they will want two things: security guarantees from the world, since any guarantee from Israel is worthless, but security guarantees from the Western world that what they rebuild will not be smashed to rubble. And they will want to make sure that Hamas, which is a Qatar-aligned organization that they no longer sympathize with, is not in charge. There won't be there is no extremely democratic outcome of this. There is only a cold peace.
Right. So I would just suggest that, the invasion from Israel of Gaza was not an American policy or an Israeli policy, but was rather a reaction, right, to the October 7th. That the aim of October 7th was precisely to create conditions for this kind of war.
The aim of October 7th was to kill the Abraham Accords, among many other things, and they succeeded. It was successful, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, and I think it was terrible. I also think it was terrible that the left, part of the left, celebrated October 7th as an anti-colonial uprising. If you respect Hamas as a fighting force, and I think one should then expect them to fight according to the laws of war, which is to not target civilians, to not kidnap children, babies, and elderly people, which they did. However, it's too late now to condemn that after what happened. But I think October 7th, the purpose of October 7th was to remind the world that was talking about Ukraine, that was talking about other issues, that there's also, this war zone that should not be forgotten. Ukraine has stolen the limelight. The whole world knows now what a Ukrainian flag looks like. The whole world knows that the Ukrainian accent is to say Kyiv and not Kiev. So, all eyes upon them. They got their glory, but the Palestinian issue was almost forgotten or swept under the carpet, also by the Arab regimes who liked Abraham Accords' promise of Israeli technology and Israeli weaponry. Well, Israeli technology and Israeli software.
Why do you say the Abraham Accords have been defeated? The last I read, the Bahrainians and others have stated their intentions to continue under the Accords.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Bahrain is a very small police state that has undergone many changes since the tensions around the Arab Spring because of a kind of soft civil war between the Shia and Sunni, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. However, Riyadh and Qatar, for them, this genocide is a game changer, and they want the Abraham Accords, but there has to be a precondition, and their populations will simply not forgive them if they just ignore this and go about business as usual. So, even Sisi has changed his position, of course, because of Rafah, which is on the border, and and Egypt, of course, signed on to the court case in The Hague. So it's increasingly checkmate for the Abraham Accords. That doesn't mean that they don't want the Abraham Accords, but they're also afraid that 2010, 2011, that period of revolts will happen again if they don't do or say something. Look at Erdogan, had an unexpected electoral humiliation in Turkey because Erdogan, he had said in speeches to the Turkish military, don't be surprised if we're fighting soon in Gaza against the Israelis. But instead, he thought he could satisfy his population with a show or a pretension of legitimacy to his regime by saying, yes, he, Erdogan, signs on to the court case in The Hague, as if the Europeans care or are impressed by Erdogan signing his name onto the South African case. Turkey has no such credibility. They're just seen as the bouncers of the Mediterranean who keep certain people from crossing into Europe. That's all. That's why they're paid 7 billion euros a year to be thugs who effectively are effective doormen. And there's no moral credibility there. So the dissatisfaction of the Turkish population about Turkey's docility towards the Israeli actions in Gaza are a big factor in Erdogan losing elections. So people are afraid. Not that Turkey was, not that Turkey had the position of Riyadh in the past, but people in the region are nervous because they have also contributed to the idea of Israeli power over America because they have demanded pitifully little of America. They have not, and I think maybe the Arab American community, rather than just trying to twist the arm of the Biden administration, which they should, I guess, they should also tell the Middle Eastern states, who they also have links to, of which they are also dual nationals and citizens. They should also tell the Middle Eastern states, why don't you boycott petroleum to the West until there's a just resolution to this? Why is everything about what the Democratic Party or the Republicans do, or RFK Jr. or Cornel West? Why not also make demands of the rest of the world? Since you're used to bossing around the rest of the world anyway.
Well, has any of the signatories to the Abraham Accords formally broken with them? That would be the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan.
I think that they have all issued some form or another of condemnation at Davos, and that's a number of summits and in public. However, sorry, I'm not up to date as to. But I do think that they're hesitant to announce that the Abraham Accords are dead and buried. They're very hesitant about that because it's just too lucrative and too promising to them. So they've found other ways of protesting this rather than saying we're killing the Abraham Accords, since it's very realistic that Trump will be reelected now. And so if Trump is reelected, he wants to push through with Abraham Accords, of course. So that's in their interest. They also don't want to run afoul of Trump by saying they're going to poo-poo the Abraham Accords. However, they are condemning Israel, and they have to condemn Israel. There's no way around it. But I think,
right. So I agree with that. But I would imagine that to say that the Abraham Accords are dead and buried is to, I would think,
too optimistic.
Preclude the idea that they will be, taken up again within 6 to 8 months of, or sometime after Trump is elected. If he's elected, or even if Biden gets a second term, the possibility for those for them
Or
to hold.
RFK Jr.
Or
RFK Jr.
RFK Jr. Okay, I mean, I think that's incredibly unlikely. But I guess what I would question is, like, well, I mean, I guess to return to the point of the reason I exist, it's not to, you know, to treat the world politics as sports or something. None of these outcomes are going to help advance working people's rights or living standards in the region. It seems to me, at least that's not what they're aimed. None of them are aimed at that. And what I think the left ought to be asking itself is, what can it do to be able to have an independent politics that could intervene in ways that aren't dictated by all of these elite state interests, but which would be more directly in the interest of both Israeli and Palestinian and American and
under the Trump years, you had Italian dock workers who blocked large cargo shipments of weapons to Saudi Arabia out of concern for the Yemen genocide, which showed that these dock workers had a great capacity of empathy, even if some of them ended up voting for Giorgia Meloni, I don't know. But they had certainly enough empathy for people who are, very different from them in some respects, to block these shipments. And I think that maybe that is a way to go, to see how, if, the hand of senile executive supreme being Joe Biden cannot be forced one way or another, even if he's faced with electoral defeat, due to the obsession of regime change, due to his responsiveness to the defense contractors, due to his responsiveness to Israeli demands or pleas, due to his senility, I think, is a major factor. But he's just, I think also, there was a theory in the 60s of, there was a countercultural movement, I think partly led by people like Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary. And they had theories about how Stalin became stupider all the time. Their theory was that in a hierarchical dictatorial model of government, the quality of the information going upwards is always getting worse, more deteriorated, more corrupted, and more inferior, because everyone below the authoritarian figure at the top is afraid of the consequences of telling the truth or of giving accurate information. And that was their explanation for how figures like J. Edgar Hoover or Stalin became stupider and crazier and more lunatic and more paranoid over time, because everyone was lying to them, because everyone would face terrible consequences for telling the truth. And I think this is what happened in the past 4 years of Biden, is that everyone, people were so afraid of the consequences of speaking out on Ukraine. Assets were seized of journalists via PayPal. The German bank seized the assets of a German citizen, a journalist who was giving unfavorable reportage on Ukraine. There was so much warfare. So many small independent media groups were attacked with algorithms, were demonetized, maybe for a while it happened to you. And so people became so scared of the consequences, and also scared of being told by the Democratic Party that they would be instrumental to Trump regaining power if they criticized Biden's horrific foreign policy, his woke imperialism. So there was just a blanket silence. There was just a complete lack of criticism towards Biden's wars over the past 3.5 years. And somehow it's always the Holy Lands. It's like some Christological force in the psyche of people that somehow, when it's about Israel and Palestine, people then speak out. Then they're against cancel culture. Or the Republicans are suddenly for cancel culture, the left is suddenly against cancel culture, the Republicans are suddenly for the war. Previously, they were against the wars. The leftists, the liberals, or the Democrats are suddenly against this war. So somehow the moment of truth is always related to anything to do with the Holy Land. And I don't want to trivialize the genocide, but I also don't want to trivialize the world food crisis that was caused by this unnecessary, dragged out Ukraine war. I don't want to trivialize, what happened in Afghanistan. So apparently, when it's about Israel and Palestine, that's somehow where the line is. I think that's more psychological than anything else. But before October 7th, there was so much blanket conformism under the Biden administration from people from the Democratic Socialists of America, progressive movements in Europe, progressive movements in all over the West, that somehow I think they became used to this routine. They became used to this playbook of expecting total conformity for their policies of limitless warfare. And I think that's where this problem came from, and not from an especially unusual Israeli lobby.
No, I agree with that. The one thing I'll say is that I don't think the United States particularly wants the Israeli conflict to continue. I think that Biden would much prefer this to be over well before November.
He wants to win. Yeah. He wants to win the conflict. He wants to he wants regime change in Gaza.
Yeah, but I think that, everyone does. So the question is how. Your difference with them is only on how it's done, not the fact that it's done. I mean, you want.
I don't want executions. I don't want.
No, I agree, but I don't think that Biden necessarily wants executions either. I think that what Biden, with the William Burns ceasefire agreement, for instance, or the attempts to constrain Israel that were much softer up to that point, I think what the Biden administration would have liked was for there to be some symbolic attack on Hamas, and I'm not quite sure how would have been resolved, except to say what you spelled out as maybe the Saudi Arabia would help to rebuild, or Hamas would agree to step aside as a governing power, and the Palestinian Authority would at least be given a shot to be elected. I think all of these things would be perfectly acceptable to Biden. And I don't think that this sort of neoconservative American exceptionalism with a lot of bloodlust is what's driving, the American policy. I do think that the United States decided with Ukraine that it was in their interest to extend that war rather than end it.
I think Ukraine established a pattern of extending wars and extending the supply of money and weapons, and that pattern was transposed onto Israel-Palestine, but nobody noticed. And the protesters who supported Zelensky are now protesting Netanyahu.
Right, but the differences between the two would be, whereas the UK and the US nixed peace agreement between Zelensky and Russia that was after 2 months of fighting, in
which Israel played a fundamental role as a negotiator alongside China.
Right. But the US said no to that and told Zelensky, don't worry, we'll just back you to the hill, keep fighting. Now it is the United States that is pushing forward for peaceful negotiations, and Israel that is turning those down, at least recently. And I don't think that I don't know. It doesn't sound to me like the same policy. Like I think, the United States would like to continue to have this cheap, in U.S. casualty terms, fight with Russia through Ukraine extended, and would like to Israeli Gaza conflict to end, and the Abraham Accords to be reinstated. And I also think the Democrats some faction within the Democrats seem to be accepting the idea that Trump will be the next president of the United States and are repositioning to prepare for the future beyond that, rather than, treating this as an existential crisis for the party or just completely backing Biden.
Perhaps that's the secret as to why Biden did not modify the Trump foreign policy, except when Trump was a little bit less aggressive, as he was on Russia. That's perhaps why maybe there was a fatalism from the very beginning, and so they didn't bother to change much or to go back to the more Obama era. Not that Obama era's foreign policy was a good one, but he did tolerate a different stance towards Cuba and Iran, among a few other places. So maybe that's why they didn't bother to change it. There was just an incipient fatalism from the very beginning as to the inability to improve anything, because that this is really the end or checkmate for the empire. I'm not sure. I'm just.
Well, I don't think our job necessarily in this conversation is to resolve all the different, and find out exactly what's true. But what I think is really good about this conversation today is that we've been at least discussing politics, rather than simply, repeating slogans. And one of the things that that's kind of built into any protest movement as a weakness is that it doesn't get beyond slogans. That it can't. It's not that they're not really designed to. They're designed to be a pressure group based on a coalition of forces that can rally around simple slogans and without having a particular political aim. That's what protest movements are for.
Yes.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that to the audience, I guess more than you. I know you agree, but if you had one key takeaway that our listeners should consider, that I haven't given you an opportunity to say yet, what would it be?
Well, I think the left has abandoned thinking about war, has abandoned theorizing about war, doesn't want to think about war, and it's been that way for a few decades. And there are a number of reasons for that, or there were a number of movements that sent it in that direction of abandoning thinking about war and geopolitics, which is inevitably intertwined, with every other kind of exploitation, and I think that was a terrible mistake, and I think we need to recommence. We need to restart in that way. We need to start once again where we left off, because the establishment never stopped, and the right wing never stopped, and the liberal radical center never stops looking for wars, even if they're preaching woke fluffiness. That's not what's really at heart. And so we need to start once again theorizing about war, talking about war, not being afraid to, make some mistakes while trying to understand the war machine. And there's no major problem today that can be resolved, including the climate crisis. The U.S. Army being the major consumer of jet fuel is fundamental in global, climate problems. So there's no way out of this.
Well, listen, thank you very much for coming by today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.